There is a photograph of Nellie Bly that almost everyone has seen, even if they cannot place the name. She is wearing a checked travel coat. A small leather satchel hangs from one hand. Her gaze is just past the camera, with the slight impatience of someone who has done this too often. I have gone back to that picture more often than I can explain. What keeps me looking at it is this thought. The woman in the photograph would be dead within 32 years of its taking. She would die nearly broke. The grave they buried her in stayed unmarked for 56 years. And nobody who looks at the photograph ever guesses. Before that picture was taken, she had walked into a New York madhouse on purpose to see what happened to the women inside. 4 doctors declared her insane. None of them bothered to look closely. She had also stood in front of Joseph Pulitzer, who ran the most widely read newspaper in America, and asked him for a job that should have killed her. After the photograph, she married a man more than 40 years older than her. The factory he owned became hers when he died. She ran it. Then she lost it to thieves working from the inside. And while New York had largely forgotten about her, she was filing dispatches from the trenches of the Eastern Front during the First World War. This is the story of a woman who climbed further out of the place she came from than almost anyone in her century. It is also the story of what waited for her at the top. I want to start in the village she was born in. None of what comes later makes sense without understanding what was taken from her in the summer of 1870. In 1864, in a corner of western Pennsylvania that almost nobody can find on a map today, there was a town named after Nellie Bly's father, Cochran's Mills. He owned the mill. He had been a judge. By the standards of Armstrong County, Michael Cochran was a wealthy man, and the daughter who arrived that May had her future apparently secure. They named her Elizabeth Jane. For the first 6 years of her life, the Cochran household had everything that mattered. Then, in July of 1870, her father died. He was 69. He had left no will. What happened next is what bent the rest of her life. Pennsylvania at that time was not a generous place to widows of men who had died intestate. The estate was carved up. Most of it went to Michael Cochran's older children from a previous marriage. By the time the lawyers were finished, his second wife and her 5 children had almost nothing. I have always found this part of the story hard to read past quickly. A man does not sit down and write a piece of paper. A 6-year-old girl loses the version of herself she might otherwise have grown up to be. Nobody set out to harm her. The system simply worked the way it was designed to work, against women and minors. She would remember this. Mary Jane Cochran did what most widows in her position did. 3 years later, she remarried. The man's name was John Jackson Ford. He drank. He hit her. One night, he threatened the family with a loaded gun. By 1878, she was suing for divorce, which was almost unheard of for a woman of her station. She needed witnesses. Her 14-year-old daughter took the stand. The court records still exist. Elizabeth testified to the threats, the violence, the gun. She described conversations she had overheard from the next room. She named what she had seen. The divorce was granted. It is the first time in any document that we hear her own voice, and what she is doing in that voice is using language as a weapon against a man who had power over her and lost it the moment she opened her mouth. She would remember that too. She tried briefly to become a teacher. The state normal school in Indiana, Pennsylvania had her for 1 term in 1879, and then her money ran out. The family moved to Pittsburgh. She was looking for the kind of work actually available to a young woman with no money and no diploma, which in 1880 meant factories and laundries and other people's houses. She did some of that. Mostly she watched the city and read newspapers, and waited for something she could not yet name. There is a strange detail from this period that always stays with me. She added a silent letter to her last name. Cochrane became Cochrane. She was not yet using the name Nellie Bly. Nobody had asked her to put on airs. She did it on her own initiative, while she was still mostly anonymous and broke, because she had decided that the woman she was going to become required a slightly different signature than the one she had been born with. She had already worked out two things that would define everything she did for the rest of her life. The first was that the world she lived in was not arranged in her favor. The second was that words, placed correctly, could rearrange parts of it. She did not have the words yet, but she was looking. She read it twice. The second time, she got a pen. The column had been published in January of 1885. The Pittsburgh Dispatch ran a regular feature by a writer named Erasmus Wilson, who signed himself the Quiet Observer. He was a popular man in the city. His subjects were domestic, mild, sometimes mawkish. That week, he had decided to weigh in on the question of working women, and his answer was that their place was in the home. A woman who worked outside it, in his telling, was something close to an offense against nature. Elizabeth Cochrane, 20 years old and still living with her mother in a boarding house, wrote a letter back. She did not give her name. She signed it, Lonely Orphan Girl. She did not expect anything to happen. She certainly did not expect what did. The editor, a man named George Madden, read the letter and thought it was brilliant. He put a notice in the next day's paper asking the writer to identify herself. She came in the following week. He hired her on the spot. Her first published piece appeared on the 25th of January, 1885. It was called The Girl Puzzle, and it argued that working women were not a problem to be solved, but a fact of the city. She needed a pen name. The standard practice for women writers at the time was to use one, partly as protection and partly because most readers did not believe a woman could write a real news column. Madden chose hers from a Stephen Foster song that had been popular for years. Nellie Bly, said the song. The typesetter at the paper misspelled it. Nellie Bly. The typo stuck. The most famous female byline of the 19th century started as a printer's error, which is the kind of detail you cannot make up. I want to pause for a second on what happened next, because it gets glossed over. She was 20 years old, she had no formal training, and the work she chose to do was not soft. She walked into the city's slum tenements and described them in plain language. The factories where women her own age were losing fingers to industrial machines for a few dollars a week, she visited and wrote about. Pittsburgh's divorce courts, where she had once sat as a witness, now had her sitting as a reporter. She interviewed women whose husbands had abandoned them and women whose husbands had not. She wrote without sentimentality, which is rare in any decade, and especially rare for a young woman writing about other women in the press of 1885. The Dispatch did not know what to do with her. Within a year, they tried to push her into the women's pages. Recipes, fashion, ladies' luncheons. She left the country. In 1886, she persuaded the paper to send her to Mexico as a foreign correspondent. She went with her mother as a chaperone, and from Mexico City, she filed dispatches that almost nobody else in the American press was writing. She covered the rural poverty. She covered the Catholic Church's grip on the country. And eventually she covered what was happening to journalists who criticized Porfirio Diaz, the strongman who controlled Mexico. This was her mistake, in a useful sense. When a Mexican newspaper editor was thrown in prison for printing something the government did not like, she wrote about it. She wrote sharply. Within weeks, she was hearing from American friends in Mexico City that she had been noticed, that she might be arrested, that it would be wise to leave. She left in a hurry. She did not file a formal goodbye. She came back to Pittsburgh and the women's pages. She lasted a few months. In the spring of 1887, she walked out of the dispatch office and left a note. It said, "More or less, I am off for New York. Look out for me." She was 22 years old, and she had a steamer ticket in her bag and almost nothing else. She did not know yet that the editor of New York's biggest paper was in the middle of a circulation war and was looking, desperately, for a story that would make people pay attention. He was going to find her, and the thing he asked her to do for him was going to come close to ending her. By the late summer of 1887, Nellie Bly had been in New York for 4 months, and the city had not yet returned the favor of her arrival. She had walked from one newspaper office to another and come away with nothing. The Sun did not need her. The Herald did not. Neither did the Tribune. The standard advice for women looking for newspaper work in New York at the time was that they should be looking elsewhere. She rented rooms and watched her money disappear. By August, she was weeks away from going back to Pittsburgh, which would have been a kind of death she did not want to consider. This is the part that always surprises me about her story. She did not break into the New York press because the press was looking for someone like her. She broke in because she walked uninvited into the office of Joseph Pulitzer's managing editor and refused to leave. His name was John Cockerill. He ran the day-to-day at the New York World, the paper Pulitzer had bought 4 years earlier, and was busy turning into the loudest, most read, most aggressive newspaper in the country. The World was at war with James Gordon Bennett's Herald for circulation, and the way Pulitzer was winning that war was by publishing stories that nobody else would touch. Crusades, exposés, stunts. He needed reporters who would do things other reporters considered beneath them, or insane. She walked into that office in September, sat down with Cockerill and pitched. Several ideas. He was not impressed by most of them. Then the asylum came up. The historical record is a little muddled about who said it first. Some accounts credit Bly, others credit Cockerill. What is documented is that an idea took shape in that room. She would feign mental illness, get herself committed to the women's lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island, and write what she found there. He paused. Blackwell's Island was a long, narrow strip of land in the East River, just off Manhattan. The city had been using it since the 1830s for the things it did not want to look at. Prisons, a poorhouse, a smallpox hospital, and the lunatic asylum, a stone building shaped like an octagon where roughly 1,700 women lived under conditions that almost nobody on the outside had ever seen and almost nobody on the inside ever left. There were rumors. There had been investigations. There had been pieces in the press for decades hinting that the place was not what it was supposed to be. None of them had stuck. None of them had come from inside. What Cockerill said, eventually, was something close to yes. There were conditions. If she could get herself committed, the World would publish what she wrote. If she could not get out, the World would arrange to get her out. Probably. He could not promise that part. She accepted. I have come back to this part of her story many times, and I still cannot quite work out the calculus. She was 23. She had no real contacts in New York, no family in the city, no guarantee that anyone would come for her if she got stuck inside. The agreement she made with the World had no legal weight whatsoever. The doctors who would examine her were going to be looking for reasons to commit her, not reasons to doubt themselves. If she succeeded too well, there would be no way out. She went home and started practicing. The boarding house she lived in had a mirror. She stood in front of it and worked on her face. She tried different versions of distracted, of vacant, of haunted. She read what she could on mental illness, as it was understood at the time. which was thin. She talked to herself. She rehearsed not knowing things. On the morning of the 22nd of September, she put on a worn dress, took most of the cash out of her bag in case the asylum stripped her, and walked to a lodging house called the Temporary Home for Females on 2nd Avenue. She gave her name as Nellie Brown. She paid for a night. Then she began to act. She would not go to bed. She told the other women in the parlor that she could not remember where she had come from. She stared at people without responding. She called the other women murderers and cried about her trunks. By the second day, they were terrified of her. By the second evening, the matron called the police. The judge who saw her the next morning was a man named Patrick Duffy. He treated her gently. He believed she was genuinely lost and ill. He asked her where she came from, and she said Cuba. He asked her almost everything else, and she said she could not remember. He sent her to Bellevue Hospital for evaluation, the same way he sent any of the dozens of unidentified women who ended up in his courtroom every month. At Bellevue, 4 doctors examined her. None of them spent long with her. One listened to her heart and pronounced her demented. Another tested her reflexes. A third asked almost no questions at all. By the time the 4th doctor came in, the paperwork was already signed. Late on the afternoon of the 25th of September, 1887, 2 attendants escorted her down to the East River, onto a ferry, and across to the asylum dock at Blackwell's Island. She walked through the iron gate of the Women's Lunatic Asylum just before sunset. She had convinced 4 doctors and 1 judge and a boarding house full of women that she had no idea who she was. And then the gate closed behind her, and the people on the other side of it did not know she was a reporter. The first thing they did was take her clothes. There were attendants in the receiving room, and a procedure that the women called the bath, although that is a euphemism. They stripped each new admission, scrubbed her with cold water and harsh soap, dumped buckets of icy water over her head, and gave her back a thin asylum dress that did not always match her body. Some women were forced into baths that other women had already been bathed in. The water in late September was already cold. The heat in the building was minimal. Bly later wrote that she shivered for the rest of the night and could not feel her feet by morning. The wards were rooms with rows of beds. The beds were too close together. The mattresses were thin and dirty. The windows were locked. There was a smell of damp wool and unwashed bodies, and the cheap soap they used in the baths. She could not sleep. Almost nobody could sleep. But the nurses did not allow movement, so the women lay still in the dark and listened to other women cry. The food was meant to be served 3 times a day. The bread was old and tough. The butter was rancid in a way that smelled of sickness. The meat, when there was meat, was sometimes spoiled. The tea was undrinkable. Patients who refused to eat were force-fed. The rest ate everything in front of them because the alternative was being beaten. The attendants were the part of Blackwell's that surprised Bly the most. She had expected the doctors to be indifferent. She had expected the building to be old. What she had not been prepared for was a class of working women hired to manage the patients who had decided, somewhere along the line, that the patients were not really people. There was a nurse named Miss Group. There was another named Miss Grady. There were others. They slapped patients who spoke too loudly. They twisted the arms of women who refused to do what they were told. One nurse, when a patient irritated her, dragged the woman by her hair across the ward floor. Bly watched. She could not intervene. The whole point of being undercover was not to behave in any way that contradicted her diagnosis. So she watched, and she remembered, and at night, when nobody was looking, she made notes in her own head that she would write down later, which I think must have been the hardest part of the assignment. The other patients are the part of the story that has stayed with me longest. Almost none of them were mad in any sense that should have led them to be locked up on an island for the rest of their lives. There was a woman named Anne Neville, a chambermaid who had become physically ill and been committed to the asylum to recover, and then forgotten there. Tilly Myard had recently come out of an illness, was unsteady on her feet, and had been declared insane by men who had known her for 10 minutes. A German woman named Louise Schantz simply did not speak English, which made her, in the eyes of the doctors and the attendants, indistinguishable from a person who could not speak at all. There were dozens like them. There may have been hundreds. Bly tried to help Tilly Myard. She told the doctors during her own examinations that Tilly was lucid. They refused to listen. By the time Bly was released, Tilly was visibly worse. Whatever frail recovery she had brought into the asylum had been broken by being treated as if she had no mind. Bly never saw her again. I have not been able to find a definitive record of what happened to her. On the 10th day, an attorney sent by the New York World walked through the gates. His name was Peter Hendricks. He carried documents that authorized her release. The asylum staff did not protest. They had never been told who she was. They simply assumed that whatever had brought her there had been resolved by whoever had now come for her, and they let her go. She walked back across the East River with her clothes in a small bundle. She had been gone for 10 days. Her exposé began running in the World on the 9th of October. It ran in 2 long parts and was almost immediately republished as a book. Within weeks, half of New York knew the name Nellie Bly. A grand jury was convened. Bly accompanied its members on a tour of Blackwell's island. By the time they arrived, the worst of what she had documented had been quickly tidied away. The rancid food was replaced. The most violent attendants had vanished. The patients she had identified by name were no longer in their wards. The grand jury wrote a report anyway. The city of New York increased its annual appropriation for the care of the insane by roughly $1 million, which is more than 30 times that figure in today's money. She was 23. She had been a working journalist for less than 3 years. And the women she had left behind on the island, the ones who could not feign sanity any more than they had been allowed to demonstrate it, were still there. The idea was to beat a fictional Englishman. Phileas Fogg, the hero of Jules Verne's 1873 novel, had circled the globe in 80 days. Bly believed she could do it in less. She walked into Cockerill's office at the New York World, pitched the idea, and was told that the assignment was good, but the world would prefer to send a man. Bly told Cockerill that if the world sent a man, she would walk across the street to another paper and beat the world's man around the world. He sent her. Hoboken, the 14th of November, 1889. The Augusta Victoria pulled away from the pier with one passenger more famous than the rest of her berth combined. Although, in fairness, almost nobody on board recognized Bly yet. Her luggage was one wool dress, a long checked travel coat, a small handbag, and several $100s in gold and English banknotes. The deadline she carried in her head was 80 days minus 1. She was 25. Cosmopolitan magazine had heard about her departure. Hours after she sailed, the magazine put a writer of its own on a westbound train. Elizabeth Bisland was 28, fluent in literary New York circles, and instructed to head in the opposite direction, picking up Asia first and leaving the Atlantic for last. Cosmopolitan wanted to beat the world at its own race. Bly did not know any of this until weeks later. The early days were quiet. London came and went briefly. The longer stop was in Amiens, France, which was the only personal indulgence on the entire itinerary. Jules Verne and his wife Honorine were waiting for her at the train station when she arrived. Werner was 61 and not well, but he had read about the assignment in the press and asked to host her at his home. Through an interpreter, he told her he hoped she could match Phileas Fogg's 80 days, and that if she made it in 79, he would applaud with both hands. Her response was that she would do it in 75. He raised a glass to her anyway. The Vernes walked her through Amiens and showed her the study where the novel was written and the wall maps where he had worked out Fogg's route. Then she got back on a train. The Amiens stop is the only one on the entire trip where I think she was treated as a peer rather than as a spectacle. By the time the trip became a national event, she was somewhere in the middle of the Indian Ocean. The World was running daily front-page bulletins on her location. The paper had set up a contest in which readers could guess her arrival time with a free trip to Europe for the closest answer. Bly herself, in her shipboard cabins, knew very little of it. Hong Kong was where she learned she had a competitor. She had stopped at the Pacific mail counter to confirm her onward booking. A clerk, hearing her name, asked if she had heard about the other woman. She had not. The clerk explained that another lady had come through Hong Kong some days earlier, travelling east to west, and was understood to be racing her. Bly stood at the counter for a long moment, doing the math. I have always thought this was the moment her assignment turned. Until that conversation, she had been on a stunt. After it, she was in a race. She got back on a ship the same afternoon. The Pacific crossing was rough. Her ship hit weather and lost time. The arrival in San Francisco on the 21st of January came hours later than her schedule had promised. The Southern Pacific had nonetheless dispatched a private locomotive to Oakland for her, chartered by the World, and the train ran east at a speed that would have been illegal for most other purposes. People gathered at every depot to wave at it as it passed. Jersey City, the 25th of January, 1890, 3:51 in the afternoon. Cannons fired. The World's official timekeeper logged her finish at 72 days, 6 hours, 11 minutes, 14 seconds. Phileas Fogg had been beaten by close to 8 days. Bisland came in less than a week behind, having missed a connecting steamer in England. Cosmopolitan blamed the agents. Bisland gave a few interviews, wrote her own book, and quietly returned to literary New York. She is now the answer to a trivia question. Bly is now on a postage stamp. The thing nobody mentions about the world race is what it did not produce. The trip should have been the launch pad for the rest of Bly's career. Instead it was, in some sense, the high watermark. I find this stretch of her life hard to explain. She returned to a newsroom that did not raise her pay. Her next stories were smaller. Her attempts at fiction did not land. Audiences on the lecture circuit were polite at best. She had circled the globe faster than anyone alive. Within 4 years, she was no longer writing for any major paper. It is hard to know what they really were to each other. He was 73 when they married. She was 30. He had never married before, ran a Brooklyn ironworks, and was worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 million in 1895 money. She had been the most famous female reporter in America, and was, by the spring of that year, more than 5 years past her last great story. Seaman is the part of this story I always get stuck on, because what we have on him is mostly silence. He left no diaries, no published correspondence, no recorded interviews. He shows up in court records and business filings and his wife's writing, and very little else. The wedding was on the 5th of April. The courtship had been brief, by all accounts no more than a few weeks. The wedding announcement, when it ran in the next morning's papers, was a single paragraph. Within weeks, it had produced legal letters from a firm representing his family. Robert Livingston Seaman had no children of his own. His estate was, in the technical legal sense, available. The nieces and nephews who had been counting on inheriting it now had a 30-year-old former journalist standing between them and the will. They sued. The first lawsuits arrived within weeks of the wedding. They argued the marriage was invalid. They argued Bly had manipulated him. Their third position was that Seaman was no longer of sound mind. The arguments were, on their merits, weak. Seaman was old, but not senile. He had married Bly in full possession of his faculties. The judge dismissed most of the claims. The litigation continued anyway, because the family had decided that the price of accepting Bly was higher than the price of fighting her. I have tried, more than once, to find evidence that the marriage was not what it appeared to be. There is some. They lived together. They travelled together. He gave her access to his businesses and seems to have respected her judgment. She nursed him through the last years of his health, which were not pleasant ones. She did not, as far as the record shows, ever leave him. He was, however, extremely rich. She was, by 1895, broke. Both things can be true. They usually are. Their 9 years together were not particularly public. The papers, when they wrote about Bly at all, did so in passing, usually attached to a society item. She had stopped giving interviews. He had never given them. They lived in a series of houses in Brooklyn and Manhattan. They travelled to Europe. They acquired things. Ironclad manufacturing was based in Brooklyn. It made enameled iron products, kitchenware, milk cans, kettles. Seaman had built it over decades into one of the larger metalworking operations in the borough. By the late 1890s, the company employed several hundred men. Bly did not technically work there. Married women in 1895 did not generally work, and Bly was now a married woman of considerable wealth. But she went. She walked the floor and watched the foreman. The books she read on her own time. Whether or not Seaman was teaching her the business on purpose, she was learning it. He died on the 11th of March, 1904. He was 81. They had been married for 9 years. He left her the businesses, the houses, the paintings, and a long set of unfinished lawsuits with his nieces and nephews. He left her an empire that someone had to run. It is one of the things I keep trying to work out about him, what he thought she would do with all of it. She had been 30 when they married. She was 39 now. The factory was hers, and so was everything else. The reasonable thing was to sell it. Robert Seaman had left her a complicated estate, a factory complex in Brooklyn that needed someone running it daily, several houses, stocks, bonds, and a New York town residence. The widow of a Brooklyn industrialist in the spring of 1904 was expected to liquidate the productive holdings, accept the cash, and live quietly off the proceeds. The lawyers from Seaman's family, who had been suing her since 1895, fully expected this. So did most of the men working at Ironclad Manufacturing. She did not sell. She walked into the office of Ironclad in Brooklyn within weeks of the funeral and told the foreman and bookkeepers that she would be making decisions. Some of them listened. Some of them did not, at first. Going back through what survives of these years, I am struck by how little drama there is. Bly took over a mid-size industrial company at the age of 39, with no executive experience, in a year when the federal government was investigating most of the country's largest manufacturers. She ran it for the better part of a decade. The company grew. Under her direction, it added new product lines, and the workforce expanded considerably. Ironclad made enameled metal goods, milk cans, kitchenware, kettles, refuse containers. Under Seaman, the product mix had been domestic. Under Bly, it shifted. The company began producing industrial containers, steel drums, refining barrels for the rapidly growing American oil industry. I have to be careful here, because this is the part of her career most often misrepresented. 3 United States patents were issued in her name during these years. The first, in 1902, was for a stacking metal container. The second was for a novel milk can. The third, granted in January of 1906, was for a metal barrel. The third patent is the one Bly is sometimes said to have invented the modern oil drum on. She did not invent it, in the engineering sense. The actual designer was a man named Henry Verhahn, who worked at Ironclad as an engineer and had a habit of patenting his improvements in his employer's name. This was a common practice at the time. The patents were Bly's because she owned the company. The designs were Verhahn's. Whether the modern 55-gallon steel oil drum used in industry today descends directly from that 1906 patent or from later refinements is a question historians of industrial design have not entirely settled. Her factory built barrels at scale. The barrels were used widely across American industry. She did other things at Ironclad that I find more interesting than the patent question. She put a recreation hall in the factory and a library next to it. She paid for medical care for her workers. She hired women into bookkeeping roles that had been held only by men. By the standards of American manufacturing in 1907, these were unusual choices. Some industrialists treated her as a curiosity. Some treated her as a quiet warning. Most simply ignored her. She gave few interviews during this period, and the ones she gave were short and businesslike. She did not write about herself or lecture. The woman who had once made a career out of being seen had become the kind of executive who answered her own correspondence. There are photographs of her from these years. Her hair was shorter, her collars higher. She looked, to the small number of people who studied her, like someone who was concentrating. By 1910, with Bly 46 and the company at its peak, Ironclad had several factories, a workforce somewhere around 1,500, and contracts with most of the major American oil refiners. She was the sole owner. She made every major decision in the company. It was the most successful thing she had ever done that nobody was watching her do. How does someone steal a fortune from a working factory without anyone noticing? The answer in Ironclad's case was a man named Edward Gilman, the chief manager and chief bookkeeper, who had been at the company for years before Bly inherited it and had stayed on through the transition. He kept the books, signed the checks, and ran the day-to-day administration of a factory complex employing around 1,500 men. Bly trusted him completely. He had been stealing from her for years. The exact figure is contested. The lowest estimate I have seen puts the total at around $200,000. The highest is closer to $1.5 million. Lawsuits at different times produced different totals. All the records agree on 3 things. The embezzlement was systematic, it ran for several years, and Bly did not know. Gilman moved money out of company accounts into accounts he and a small group of accomplices controlled. Most of it was straightforward forgery, with a parallel system of payments to suppliers that did not exist. None of it was hard to find once anyone went looking. The problem was that nobody from outside the company had been looking. Reading the bankruptcy filings now, I keep getting stuck on the timeline. Gilman and his accomplices had been operating for years before anyone caught on. The first hint of trouble came around 1909. The full picture took another year to emerge. By the time Bly understood the scale, much of the money was gone. What remained of it was moving fast through untraceable accounts. Ironclad could no longer meet its obligations. She fought. She filed criminal charges against Gilman and his accomplices. The civil suits to recover the stolen money came next. To cover payroll, while the litigation moved through the courts, she took out loans against the company and against her personal real estate. The depositions and letters to the district attorney's office multiplied. She did everything an angry plaintiff in 1910 New York could do. Most of it failed. The criminal case against Gilman ground forward slowly. He was eventually convicted on some counts and acquitted on others. Recovered funds amounted to a fraction of what had been stolen. The civil suits dragged on for years. Some were settled. Some were lost. Real estate Bly had pledged as collateral was foreclosed on by her creditors. Ironclad's largest contracts went to competitors who had been hovering around the company since the first reports of trouble. By the end of 1911, the company had entered receivership. I want to slow down here. The popular accounts tend to move past this period quickly. The bankruptcy was not a single event. It was a long, public, humiliating process that played out across the financial pages and the courtroom dockets of New York for the better part of 3 years. The Seaman family lawsuits, dormant for most of the marriage, were revived, on the theory that the bankruptcy estate now belonged in part to Robert Seaman's heirs. The family had been waiting almost 20 years to make this argument. They made it loudly. By 1913, Ironclad as Bly had run it no longer existed. The houses had been sold. The lawyers were still fighting over what was left. In the summer of 1914, she boarded a steamer for Europe. Her plan was to be gone for a few weeks. She did not see New York again for 5 years. She had left in the summer of 1914, meaning to be gone a few weeks. War broke out before her return ticket was good. By the time she finally came home, she was in her mid-50s, almost broke, and had reported the war from inside the Central Powers. Vienna in August of 1914 was strange in a specific way. The capital of an empire that was about to start losing the largest war in its history was briefly festive. Crowds gathered in the squares, cheering the declaration of war on Serbia. Cafes were full. The newspapers were full of certainty. Bly, in a hotel near the city centre, watched all of this with the sober assessment of a former muckraker who recognized the difference between public mood and underlying reality. She was supposed to be in Austria for financial reasons connected to her business affairs. Those reasons evaporated within weeks. Banks froze. Business ground to a halt. Travel out of Austria became progressively more complicated. Bly might have left in the first month of the war if she had wanted to. She did not want to. In her own writing about this period, she described an immediate decision to stay and cover what was happening. The decision, I suspect, sounds clearer in retrospect than it actually was. She had no press credentials and no contract. She was 50 years old, in a city whose language she did not speak, and had not done a serious news story in over a decade. She did have 25 years of muscle memory about how to talk her way into places. She got herself accredited to the Austrian Imperial Army as a journalist within months. She filed dispatches to the New York Evening Journal, William Randolph Hearst's flagship paper, which had agreed to publish her work and pay her per piece. She went to the front. What she covered was the Serbian front and then the Eastern Galician front. She visited Przemysl in 1915, after the Austrians retook it from the Russians. She rode in artillery convoys and slept in field hospitals. By the end of the year, she was the first American woman to have reported from the trenches of the war. I cannot read her wartime dispatches without flinching at some of them. They are uneven in a way her earlier work was not. Some of them are excellent. Some of them are propagandistic in ways the New York World version of Bly would have found embarrassing. She wrote sympathetically about the Central Powers in a way that did not age well after the United States entered the war on the other side. The Evening Journal published her work selectively, and eventually, as American sentiment turned, less and less of it. In 1917, after the United States declared war on Germany and Austria-Hungary, things got difficult. Bly was an enemy alien in Vienna. She was briefly detained on suspicion of espionage, released and watched, depending on who you asked, with interest or with malice. She continued to report. Some of what she filed was held by Austrian censors. Some of it disappeared. The rest ran in Hearst papers anyway. By the time the war ended in November of 1918, Bly was broke, ill, and stuck in a city whose government no longer existed. The Austrian Empire collapsed within weeks of the armistice. She spent the next several months negotiating papers, waiting for steamships, and helping other Americans get out. She returned to New York in 1919. She had been gone almost 5 years. She had reported a war from the wrong side of the Atlantic, with no employer for most of it, and not much money for any of it. She had also become, to the small number of journalists who paid attention to such things, the most experienced female war correspondent of her generation. There is something about her return I think about a lot. The loneliness comes off her later writing. She came home to a country that had moved on without her. She would, however, find a use for the rest of her life. 3 years separated her return to New York from the day she died. In those 3 years, working out of an office at William Randolph Hearst's New York Evening Journal, she did some of the strangest and most unexpected work of her career. She wrote a column. She covered a few news stories the paper's editors thought she still had legs for. She gave a handful of interviews about the war. And she became, almost by accident, the city's most efficient, unofficial adoption broker. Most popular accounts skip past this stretch entirely, which is a shame. The orphan column is the most moving work of her professional life. Bly used her column at the Journal to write about specific abandoned and orphaned children in New York. She named them. She described them. Readers were invited to write in if they were interested in taking one home. The system worked. By her own count, she helped place dozens of children in homes between her return in 1919 and her death in 1922. I would give a lot to know what happened to those children. Some of these placements were, by the standards of modern adoption practice, alarming. She vetted families informally. She moved children quickly. She did not always know what happened to the children after they were placed. None of this would meet the standards of any 21st century social services agency. The orphan column took an old, ill, professionally diminished woman in the last years of her life and gave her something to work on that mattered to her. She had grown up watching her mother be powerless inside a legal and economic system designed against her. She had spent a career writing about women and children who had no one. The orphan column was, in a way, sustained work that mattered. It just was not glamorous. She got pneumonia in January of 1922. She had been ill for some time. The 5 years in Austria had not been kind to her health. She was admitted to St. Mark's Hospital in Manhattan. She died on the morning of the 27th of January, 1922. She was 57 years old. The funeral was small. The Hearst papers ran respectful obituaries. The other New York papers ran shorter ones. Within a week, almost nobody in New York was talking about her death anymore. She was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, in a plot purchased by family. The plot was not marked. The thing I have not been able to get past, in all of this, is how ordinary the reason was. She did not have a stone because nobody got around to ordering one. Time passed. The people who would have remembered her died. The grave at Woodlawn sat unmarked for 56 years. People who came looking for it could not find it without a map from the cemetery office. The stone that is there now was put up by the New York Press Club in 1978. It identifies her as a journalist. In the years since, her name has slowly been recovered. The asylum exposé has been republished. The world race has been the subject of multiple books and stage adaptations. There is a park in Brooklyn named after her. There is a stamp. There are recurring suggestions of biopics that never quite get made. There is no satisfying answer, for me, to the question her life keeps asking. She did almost everything a working journalist could do in her time, and she did most of it before she was 35. The remaining 27 years of her life were not so much an anticlimax as a different shape of life entirely. She tried things. Some of them failed. People she trusted robbed her. She lived through a war she had no business covering, and covered it anyway, and came home to a country that had stopped paying attention. She is buried in the Bronx, under a stone that arrived 56 years after she did. There is, again, that photograph of her in the checked travel coat. She is 25 years old in it, about to do the thing that will make her famous. She does not yet know that she has already done the thing that mattered most, which was a 10-day stretch on Blackwell's Island that put a lot of cruel people out of work and probably saved some lives she never met. She does not know that the world race will be her last unambiguous triumph. She does not know about Robert Seaman or Ironclad or any of what is coming. Most of what makes her important does not end up on a stamp. The piece I keep with me, after years of reading her, is that she was the first kind of journalist who did things, instead of just describing them. She built something afterward, and lost it, and started over again at 50 in a foreign capital. She was robbed, and she was humiliated. People stopped paying attention to her. She got up and worked anyway. The unmarked grave is not really the point. The point is that the woman in the checked coat did not stop, even after almost everything had stopped on her.